All right, let's dive right into this fascinating lecture by Dr. Ted Hildebrandt and uncover the hidden history of these ancient texts. When most people think of ancient biblical manuscripts, they tend to picture dusty, static, kind of boring rule books. But today, in this explainer, we're going to crack open the pages of Matthew and Mark to reveal a vibrant world full of hidden messages, high-stakes drama, and some deeply human flaws. We're going to look right past the surface and decode what is actually going on. So, I want you to ask yourself, what do ancient number codes, runaway teenagers streaking through Jerusalem, and secret underground code words have to do with the world's most famous texts? Well, as it turns out, literally everything. Rather than reading like a rigid rulebook, these texts are actually jam-packed with complex literary mechanics and behind-the-scenes drama. That is, if you know exactly where to look. Act 1, Cracking Matthew's Hidden Jewish Code. We're going to kick off our detective work with the book of Matthew, which opens with what seems like a totally mind-numbing genealogy. Now, to a modern reader, a giant list of who begot who feels like a pretty slow start. But for the ancient Jewish audience, this was a brilliant, highly coded resume. See, in ancient times, they didn't have separate alphabets and numbers. Their letters actually doubled as their numbers. It's a code known as gematria, and Matthew cleverly structures his genealogy into 3 sets of exactly 14 generations. Why the number 14? Well, in Hebrew consonants, the name David is spelled D-V-D. Dalet is 4, Vav is 6, Dalet is 4. Add those up and you get exactly 14. Matthew is secretly spelling out David to prove, right from the starting line, that Jesus is the ultimate Davidic king. It's this incredible inside nod to his Jewish audience. But here is the absolute brilliant twist. In a culture that heavily prized pure, patriarchal Jewish lineages, Matthew secretly smuggles 4 specific women into this supposedly pure list: Tamar, Rahab, Uriah's wife, who we generally know as Bathsheba, and Ruth. Now, not only do some of these women have deeply scandalous backstories, but more importantly, they are all foreigners. We're talking Canaanites, a Hittite connection, a Moabite. Matthew is completely subverting his audience's expectations right on page 1. And this perfectly illustrates how the author intentionally planted these outsider women as early clues to a massive narrative shift. I mean, Matthew starts off incredibly exclusively, with Jesus actually telling his followers to strictly avoid the Gentiles and only go to the lost sheep of Israel. But by the very end of the book, we get the famous Great Commission, which transforms a strictly Jewish mission into a massive, global, inclusive message for all nations. The clues for that epic ending were planted all the way back in that seemingly boring genealogy. Moving on to Act 2, the danger of literalism. Let's look at our second mystery and see how this builds into the real challenge of interpreting these ancient words today. Because once you realize the text is using sophisticated literary devices like gematria, you start to figure out that reading everything woodenly literal might actually cause you to miss the point completely. Take the Sermon on the Mount, for instance. Jesus makes some incredibly shocking and extreme statements, like this famous command: if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. Or, telling people to literally cut off their own hands. So it naturally begs the question, should we take this ancient command literally? If you put yourself in the shoes of an ancient listener for a second, you have to ask, did the early church actually expect a congregation full of people missing an eye and a hand? Was the ultimate goal of this text to cause mass physical mutilation? Of course not. Because honestly, even if you take out your eye, the human mind can still easily lust. This is where understanding context is absolutely vital. Dr. Hildebrandt introduces the academic tool of hermeneutics, which is just a fancy word for the science of interpretation. A key hermeneutical tool is recognizing hyperbole, which is a deliberate overstatement for dramatic emphasis. Jesus wasn't demanding physical mutilation. He was using bold hyperbole to make a dramatic, unforgettable point about taking the issue of sin seriously. And recognizing that changes everything when we look at commands like turn the other cheek. If you read that with universal absolutism, you might think you can literally never resist a truly evil threat. But Dr. Hildebrandt points out the actual cultural context here. A backhanded slap on the right cheek in the ancient world was a very specific act of public humiliation. It was not a lethal attack. Stripping this of its cultural context can dangerously distort the text, essentially depriving believers of the right to protect the innocent from true evil. It's really about enduring personal insults, not enabling violence. I mean, we use hyperbole today all the time, right? When we say literally everyone was at the game, we don't mean every single human on planet Earth. The text does the exact same thing. It says all Jerusalem went out to see John the Baptist. But Dr. Hildebrandt reminds us that we know there was a crippled man stuck at the pool of Bethesda for 38 years. He certainly couldn't make the grueling 20-mile hike down to the river. The word all is just a hyperbole. It means a massive crowd, not a literal, strict census. Which brings us to Act 3, the human drama of Mark. Finally, let's step completely behind the text to uncover the deeply flawed yet absolutely fascinating author behind our second text, John Mark. So if Matthew is sort of the methodical architect, Mark gives us a raw, fast-paced, and incredibly human look at the early church. And get this, Mark might have actually authored himself right into his own book. During the incredibly tense scene in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is arresting, Mark includes this bizarre detail that's found in no other account. He writes about a young man in a linen garment who gets grabbed by the guards, slips out of his clothes, and flees into the night completely naked. Scholars point out that Mark was likely a wealthy kid living in Jerusalem at the time, and he uniquely authored himself into history as the streaking teenager running from the garden. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But Mark wasn't just a funny footnote. He was a real, deeply flawed person who made massive mistakes. His journey is this highly emotional detective story of human failure. As a young man, Mark actually quit his first big missionary job, just completely bailing on the Apostle Paul and his cousin Barnabas. A few years later, Paul is actually so angry at Mark's flakiness that it causes a massive relational rift, permanently breaking up the legendary duo of Paul and Barnabas. But the story doesn't end there. Decades later, in 68 AD, a dying Paul writes from a Roman prison, "Get Mark, he is helpful to me." It's just this beautiful, real-world story of a young quitter ultimately finding reconciliation. Now, this naturally brings up a great question. If Mark wasn't an original eyewitness, and he was never one of the 12 apostles, how in the world did his writing make it into history? Well, because he wasn't an eyewitness to most of Jesus' life, early church historians like Papias reveal that Mark actually penned his text by becoming the official secretary and translator for the Apostle Peter. So you are essentially reading Peter's gritty, action-packed memories straight through Mark's pen. And their bond became incredibly tight over the years. Towards the very end of Peter's life, he writes this cryptic message to the churches, affectionately calling this former runaway teenager his spiritual son. My son Mark. But hold on, Peter's message says, "Greetings from she who is in Babylon." There was no Christian church in ancient ruined Babylon. So what's actually going on here? This reveals the perilous life-or-death reality of the early church. They had to use Babylon as a secret underground code word for the city of Rome. Peter and Mark were surviving together, shoulder to shoulder under Emperor Nero's violently oppressive and fiery regime in Rome. Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. Are these ancient texts just flat, one-dimensional roles? Or, as we've seen today, are they a rich archaeological dig of hidden gematria codes, subverted expectations with foreign outsiders, and deeply human stories of failure and redemption? When we use tools like historical context and literary analysis, we unlock a completely different, totally captivating way to read history. The words literally jump off the page. So the next time you look at an ancient text, I want you to ask yourself, what secret code is waiting just beneath the surface?